Good morning. So good to see so many of you out there this morning. We appreciate your presence, each and every one of you. Just a couple of reminders. There's a lot happening right now. We just started the new quarter. Not that we meant to start new classes on the new quarter. It just happened that way. We're currently in the study of one another Sunday morning. I encourage you to pick up the material in the lobby. And then tonight we'll be starting our study on zeal, how to cultivate a zeal for God that lasts. And so just a reminder, that material is in the lobby. And so tonight's lesson 1, and we'll be meeting here again at 6 p.m. for that Bible study. Now, I could do the easy thing and just say I'll go home because Kurt pretty much said everything I was going to say this morning in Bible class, but not all of you were there, and that's okay. We're gonna be covering it again this morning. So we want to open your Bibles to Matthew, the 25th chapter, Matthew chapter 25. We're going to be looking at the parable of the talents. Again, Matthew, the 25th chapter. This year, our preaching theme for this year is on faithfulness. Last year, it happened to be one another's. Now, Kurt is doing a more in-depth study of that, and faithfulness seemed appropriate as we were coming out of the limited capacity of our assemblies and the lockdowns and the pandemic, that we would need lessons on how to be faithful and to grow in faithfulness and to continue to grow in that. And so we've spent the last couple months talking theory-wise. What does it mean to be faithful? How God is our example of faithfulness. And the parable of the talents basically gives us a case study of what does faithfulness look like in action. And we're going to be covering some of the things. Again, Kurt did very well this morning in the Bible class. But again, we want to cover it again this morning. So let's start with the parable before we make its application. Matthew chapter 25, we'll start in verse 14. And we'll read the whole parable and then we'll break it down little by little. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey. Immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received the 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I have gained you 5 more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And also the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I have gained you 2 more talents. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one who had received the 1 talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. And I was afraid, and I went away and hid your talent to the ground. See, you have what is yours. But his master answered and said to him, You wicked, lazy slave. You knew that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I will receive my money back with interest. Take away the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents. For to everyone who has more shall be given, and he who has an abundance from that which the one who does not have, even that which he does have, shall be taken away. Throw out the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The parable of the talents is the last of a series of 3 parables that Jesus is teaching in response or in extension of his teaching in Matthew 24. Matthew 24, the first part of that, deals with the destruction of Jerusalem, and then he moves in towards the later part there, around verse 42 or so, about his return. And after he speaks about his return, the second coming, he uses these 3 parables to illustrate lessons about what we should be doing while we await his return. The first of these parables is that of the fig tree, which is in Matthew 24, verses 32 through 41, which is the need to be diligent and vigilant and looking for his coming, be eagerly anticipating. Then you have the parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13, which teaches the lesson that we need to be prepared for when he returns. And the parable of the talents teaches the lesson, and I'm giving it away now, but it teaches the lesson that we need to not only be prepared, but active in the God's kingdom while we await his return. We get to the parable itself. Verses 14 through 18, we have the setup of the parable. The master distributes the talents, each according to his own ability. You see there in verse 15, in fact, I would underline according to his own ability. It's a very key phrase in this parable. Now, Kurt made this point this morning, but a talent here is a very large sum of money, so much large that we really can't conceive of it. Maybe to put it into perspective, Athens at its height had an annual budget for the whole nation of 7 talents, if memory serves me correctly. So here you have a man who has 5 talents. We're talking the sum of money, the amount of money that kingdoms would operate off of is how much money these men are being entrusted with. Now, why this is a parable that deals with specifically money usage, and it's very similar to Jesus' parable of the minas in Luke's account, we rightfully extrapolate the application to our God-given gifts. And that can be wealth. That can be health, time, our abilities, which we'll be focusing in on this morning. But he sets them up. And he doesn't give anyone more than what they can handle. He is fair to each and every one of them, according to their own ability. 5, 2, and 1. Then we see here in verse 9, now after a long time, the master of those slaves came back and settled accounts with them. Now that phrase, if I understand correctly in the original languages, indicates that he was delayed. It was longer than expected. So there was an abundance of time before this master comes back. And applying this to waiting for Jesus' return, it does feel like that sometimes. It seems that he has been delayed. We're still waiting. The promise is not slow. We know he's still coming, but we're still waiting. And so we need to still be active in the kingdom. So he settles accounts with the 5 and the 2. And how he settles is pretty much the same. He praises them for their stewardship. They were faithful. Remember back a couple months ago, we defined faithful as dependable, ethical, and honest in all your dealings. That's the root of it. And so they were faithful with the trust the master had given them. And they had doubled their proceeds, or doubled the money. They had made a return on the investment for the master. They were rewarded with more and with praise. And the final reward was they got to enter the joy of their master, which is the ultimate reward for all of us when we get there on the day of judgment where we hear good and faithful servant enter in. But now we come to the 1-talent man. Now before we go into too much detail with him, I want to make the point again. The master did not give him an impossible or unreasonable task. He didn't, the master didn't say, oh, well, you have the ability for 1 talent, so I'm going to give you 10. I'm going to give you more than you can handle. The master doesn't do that. He gives them what is appropriate. The 1-talent man had the same opportunity as the 2 and the 5-talent men. It seemed that the 1-talent man had just a relative amount or maybe the same skills and finance as these other 2, because again, 1 talent is, as we said, 1/7 of Athens' annual budget. Okay, that's a large sum of money. Master had some trust in this man. So the man was worthy of at least the trust and the respect of receiving 1 talent. So we get to the 1-talent man, and he did nothing except bury his talent. We don't know where he buried it. Could have been guarded, could not have been guarded. We don't really know his stewardship of that. But he goes away and he just buries it. And his excuse, he begins to make an excuse in verses 24 through 25. And judging by the master's response in 26, these are unfounded accusations against the master. He says, well, I knew you to be a hard man. You're a ruthless man. You reap from people who you've made no invested in. So I was terrified. I know it's your fault why I buried the talent. And the master goes, fine. If you think I'm that kind of man, if you think I'm this hard dictator or despot of a master who who gathers where I've scattered no seed, and I'm a hard man, and I'm ruthless to you, and I mistreat you, then you ought to have at least put it in the bank. It says, by your own logic, this is what should have been the logical response to your thinking if it was accurate. Then I would at least gotten back the money. We see the result of the one-talent man is he was completely cast away from the presence of the master. Completely. And it's not for lack of profit. That's a secondary issue. It's by the very fact that he did nothing with the trust that he was given. He sat on it. By the master's own logic, that if he had at least put it into the bank and had interest, the one-talent man could have come up with them like, sir, I was scared, I didn't know what to do, so I loaned it to the bank, and so now you have interest back on the money. That showed forward thought and at least good stewardship. And by the master's response, at least I take the implication that the master would have been fine with that. But no, he does nothing. So what do we make of it? What do we make of this parable? Now, as we mentioned earlier, the parable teaches a lesson about the Lord's coming, that we need to be faithful and active in the Lord's kingdom while we await his return. And in the parable, the master represents God, and each of the slaves represents all of us. Now, depending on what we are doing or will do in this life will determine what slave we are, whether the 5 or the 2 or the 1. And really, it's a simple question. Are we active in God's kingdom or are we not? And that determines really one of the 2 categories we're going to be in. But I want to pull a few lessons from this, thinking about what it means to be faithful and how this is a case study in what faithfulness is. The first of these is the fact that all of us have been entrusted with something. We've all been given something by God according to our own ability. I want to turn to Romans chapter 12. Again, Romans, the 12th chapter, starting in verse 4. I believe we know the first several verses of this chapter very well about the need to be transformed by the renewing of our mind and present ourselves a sacrifice pleasing to God. We're going to actually start in verse 3. That we get the whole thought. Paul writes in Romans 12 and verse 3, For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you not to think more highly of himself than he ought to think, but to think as so to have sound judgment, as God has allowed to each a measure of faith. For just as we are many members in one body, and all the members do not have the same function, so we, who are many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another. So since we have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, each of us has to exercise them accordingly. If prophecy, according to the proportion of his faith. If service, in his serving. Or if he who teaches, in his teaching. Or he who exhorts, in his exhortation. Or he who gives with liberality. He who leads with diligence. He who shows mercy with cheerfulness. So Paul's point here is, and it's rooted in the gospel truth of grace. He says in verse 3, For through the grace given to me, say not to everyone, not to think more highly than you ought to. Don't become inflated. Don't have an inflated ego. Don't think that your gifts are just God's gift to mankind, that somehow by your presence you just make everything better. Have appropriate judgment. But he says in verse 6, Since we have gifts that differ according to grace, all of our abilities, all of our talents, our wealth, our time, they're not ours. What we have is because God has shown his favor upon us. If you have been gifted with the ability to be good in finance and business and you've made large sums of money, that's thanks to God. And there's a responsibility that you have because of that gift. If you're like Kurt, who thinks he's the world's best teacher, as he said this morning, then you have a responsibility to exercise that accordingly. But as Paul says, each of us has been given something according to the grace that God has given us. And so because these gifts and abilities and talents are solely by God's grace, he has given to us freely when we do not deserve them, that indebts us. that obligates us to make good use of those gifts that God has given us for His glory and His kingdom. Now, somebody say, well, I don't know what gifts I have. One baseline gift that all Christians have, regardless of your teaching ability, regardless of how well you can speak or not speak, or your intellect, doesn't matter where you're at. If you're a Christian, you have been given the gospel. You have been taught the gospel correctly, and so you have an obligation to be a good steward of that gospel. Now, we make these points when we teach on evangelism that not everyone is going to be a teacher. James would warn against everyone becoming teachers in chapter 4, verse 1. Let not many of you become teachers, lest you incur stricter judgment. But each of us does have an obligation to at least grow, to live by the gospel, to embody the gospel. And sometimes that is the biggest contribution to the kingdom of God you can give, is just being Christ-like, embodying the gospel. But make no mistake, if you know you have more abilities than that, you cannot settle for just simply living like Christ. To whom much is given, much is required. But we have all been given something. The gospel, time, abilities, talents. So now, how might we determine our talents? We need to determine them. If we're going to be of use to God's kingdom, we can't sit idly by. We need to know what we're good at. Now, Solomon in Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 20, 19 verse 20, I inverted that 9 there. This is not the only place where Solomon speaks about the wisdom of counsel, but he says, listen to counsel and accept discipline, that you may be wise the rest of your days. There's two really steps, I would say, to find out your talents, and they feed into each other, and there's no really right way to do them in. But I'm going to present them this way. First is trial and error. You just have to put yourself out there. If you're a new convert, I remember back when I was a first new convert, the elders there were very active and get me involved in everything. And some of it was an utter disaster. Not going to lie to you, not going to smudge the truth. First time I led singing, it was Glory Land Way. It was very upbeat and very fast at the first measure. Last measure was a funeral dirge. And I didn't touch singing for 6 years after that. I'm like, okay, it's not for me. Same thing with preaching. First sermon I gave was 3 months after I was baptized. I'm not saying that to brag, because if you sat through it, it was not a pleasant experience. I, for whatever reason, felt the need to bring my James Fawcett and Brown commentary my grandmother gave me. I put it up here. I had another Bible over here. I had my little New Testament here. And I couldn't find James to save my life. And I was white-knuckled the pulpit the entire time. And I felt the need to wear a 3-piece suit in Oregon summer where it's 50% humidity and it was 86 degrees outside in a 100-year-old church building that had no AC. And I blew through 45 minutes worth of material in 10 minutes. But if you sat through it, it was a long 10 minutes. I didn't touch preaching again for a long time. You try things. And the second part of this is seeking counsel from others. Our friends and family know our strengths and weaknesses better than we do. Sometimes they're glaringly obvious to others and not ourselves. Back when we were doing majority of the pre-recorded stuff, I didn't notice it, Kurt did. I said a lot in the recordings of Matthew. So much so where Kurt said to me one time, just go watch last week's video and just see how many times you say it. I turned it off after like a minute because it was just too high. I didn't even know I was doing it. It was glaringly obvious to Kurt. And we found out once I'm in front of a live audience, it pretty much goes away. So we decided, we're just going to live stream and no more pre-recording. And for that, I thank the elders. But others see it better than we see it in ourselves. So if you don't know what you're good at, just start going down the list. Okay, I'm going to try my hand and trying to encourage somebody. You might stick your foot in your mouth. It happens. The brethren if they're Christ-like, they're going to love you and forgive you anyway. You all have done that the last 3 years with me. Maybe try your hand at teaching. And teaching is one of those talents, and this is another point. Some talents take longer to develop than others. Some are innate, some take time. Mark Copeland, who preaches the gospel in Kissimmee, Florida, he grew up in the same area that I did several decades apart in Oregon. He had a very severe speech impediment as a child, debilitating almost. And yet he preaches the gospel for the last 40 years, I believe. Any of you have worked a lesson outline or preached? Do you know the site Executable Outlines? Okay, that's Mark Copeland's website. Men in his life, people in his life saw that he had there was something there, so they encouraged him to keep on developing it and work through it to where you couldn't tell he had a speech impediment as a child now. And this is where, again, elders and members come into play, is they might see you have an ability. It's a diamond in the rough that we just got to help smooth out. I'll tell one last example of this before we move on to the next point. Probably the best experience I had was at my training program at 5th Street in Beaverton, Oregon. Mark Dunnigan, to his credit, he did a lot, but he really didn't give me a whole lot of feedback because he didn't need to on my sermons. We still met Monday morning, and we had the autopsy of what I just did Sunday. By our two brethren, Paul and John Goodwin, after every lesson I preached, those two men would come up. And I didn't dread it, because they always followed the same formula. They always had something good to say, but then they always had something that, like, okay, I remember one time I used a verse. It said what I wanted to say, but I didn't use it faithfully, and I pulled it out of context. And I'll admit it was because I was rushing through a sermon outline. He said, well, that made your point, but that wasn't in context. You might want to consider this verse instead. And again, that kind of stuff, that for 2 years, those two men helped smooth out the rough edges. And they did so in a loving way where it was received. So maybe you're thinking, maybe you do know your talents, your abilities. And maybe you're thinking, well, I need to help others find theirs. That's a talent of itself. But one little point on that. Just remember that advice from the wrong source will be criticism every time. So make sure you have a good relationship with the person first. Make sure they know it's coming from a right place. And there's some personalities that just don't mesh. That's okay. I bet there's some of you who are watching or here this morning that I maybe drive you up the wall. That's okay. I love you anyway. But we gotta band together. It takes trial and error, and it takes counsel from others to figure out what our talents are. And it can be a painful process, but growth always requires some level of pain or resistance to that. Put yourself out there. Another lesson here. As we said in this one, whether we have a bazillion talents or you're the one talent person, God expects faithfulness no matter what we've been given with. No matter how many abilities, how well we have them, God expects us to be faithful. I know it's interesting to me, in Matthew 25, back to the parable, verses 21, 23, the master said to both the 5-talent man and the 2-talent man, he said, you were faithful with a few things. I don't know why, I just found it interesting, because here's the man who has 5 talents. That's a lot of money. And the master said, you were faithful in a very little thing. And for the person who I would say is maybe tempted to be prideful in their abundance of talents, God views it as pretty much you having one or none. No one's amount of talents is better than somebody else's. Just because you have 10 talents does not make you more valuable than the 1-talent person. In fact, Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 would probably say the opposite. He said the less honorable members are deserving of more honor. It's the ones who don't really seem to have a place actually tend to have the biggest impact on the congregation. But we need to be faithful in what God has given us. I like what William Hendrickson said on this parable about how to use our talents and how we're going to be judged by them. He said, the Lord grants us opportunities for service in accordance with our ability to make use of them. Hear that again. The Lord grants opportunities for service in accordance with our ability to make use of them. Accordingly, since not all men have the same ability, Therefore, not all have the same opportunity or equal number of opportunities. In the day of judgment, the number of opportunities for service or talents will not matter. The question is only, have we been faithful in what God has given us and their use? The 2-talent man was not criticized or judged for, well, why didn't you produce 5 talents? Now, on the 5-talent man, when he came back and doubled his profits, he said, why didn't you get 10? They were judged on how they made use of them. That 5-talent man could have lost it all in a stock market crash or something. I'm pretending ancient world had stock markets. He could have lost it all. But I'm convinced the master would have said, good, well done, good and faithful servant, because he was diligent and he tried to make use of the master's money. And that is kind of a reminder. It's not on the screen, but one reminder as we wind this down. We are judged against ourselves, not others. My poor teaching skills will not be judged in comparison to Kurt's phenomenal teaching skills. I'll be judged with how faithfully did I handle the text. Did I make diligent effort to try and explain the Word of God accurately and clearly so people could understand it? Not for how showy it was, not for how many pictures in my PowerPoint, not how many people I converted, but was I faithful with what God had given me? Because at the day of judgment, as Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ so that each one may receive compensation for his deeds done through the body, in accordance which has been done, whether good or bad. And in the end, I want to leave you with a formula that Nancy said this morning in class. Like I said, Kurt and Nancy just stole my outline, or they said most of it. And I appreciate them for doing it because they said it much better than I am right now. But this little formula I heard a few years ago, it's been really helpful for me in making sure I'm making good use of my abilities and gifts that God has given me. Ability plus opportunity equals my responsibility. So you think about what the parable of the talents. The 5, the 2, and the 1. They all had the same ability, so judged the master. He judged them trustworthy to leave them amount of money. They all had the same opportunity to make use of that money. Only 2 of them viewed it as their responsibility. The 1-talent man had the ability to go to the bank and deposit it. He had the opportunity to. He chose not to. I will tell you from personal experience, this little formula is actually one of the driving forces why I went into preaching. It's because I knew study was not tedious to me. From a very young age, I had no problems getting up in front of a crowd. And I got thinking, God has given me this unique mixture, or this mixture that would lend itself to teaching and preaching. Do I really want to stand on the day of judgment before Him and say, Lord, I know you gave me these abilities, but I want to be a music teacher. I want to be an accountant. I'm not saying that's how it should be for you, but for me, I couldn't sleep at night knowing that, God, you gave me these abilities, and I used it for something that wasn't to the fullest of my ability for your glory and your kingdom. Because I'll be honest, there's things that I would much rather do than preaching, because the weight and responsibility of preaching is heavy. It's very heavy. If I teach something wrong, that's on me. And I possibly have affected some of you this morning. Not in this lesson, but other times. But I do it because, again, I couldn't sleep with myself at night. And so I'm not saying you need to go into preaching, but you think about, okay, maybe you have a way of words. You're just really good at sitting and listening. And you have a day off or something. You're retired and there's a brother or sister in need. Well, that's the opportunity. You have ability. That's, I would say, your responsibility. Just go sit down and talk with them. Maybe you're really good at writing cards. I'm not. My penmanship is awful. Maybe you're really good at that. Okay? There's a lot of people in the hospital right now, care homes, they could use a card. Whatever it is, do it with all your might and do it for the glory of God. If we do this, we will we will be able to make use of our talents that God has given us. And really, maybe it's not my responsibility we should put there, but my privilege. It's our great privilege to be able to serve God. It's our great privilege to use our God-given abilities and talents for His glory. And so we need to be faithful in these things that God has given us. And I hope and pray that you will take this lesson and be determined to be more faithful this year. I am. I'm trying to put more effort than I have before in my classes and reaching out to people. I hope you've made similar resolutions this year and trying to be faithful what God has given us. So I appreciate your time this morning. But we don't want to close this hour without briefly discussing the gospel. You may be visiting here this morning, you may be watching at home, and you've been watching for some time, you've been attending for some time, and you really don't know what you must do to be saved. You need to know that Jesus loved you. He loved you enough to come and die an agonizing death on the cross so you could have the potential relationship with God. When Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected on the third day, His covenant came into effect, in which Jesus said in Mark 16, verse 16, that the one who believes in Him and is baptized shall be saved. If you disbelieve in Him, you don't believe in Him, there's no salvation. So if you've never done that this morning, if you've never obeyed the gospel and unite your life in the waters of baptism for the remission of your sins, we can assist you with that. There is water ready. Maybe you've done that in the past and you haven't been living right. Or maybe you're struggling in your spiritual walk. Now's the time. The invitation's open for all. Won't you come and stand and sing the song of invitation?